When Cheney was in the Ford White House, Congress was in the midst of its post-Watergate frenzy of reining in what was then called the Imperial Presidency. Right after Reagan was elected in 1980, the incoming White House Chief of Staff, James Baker, sought Cheney's advice about how to do this job as Chief of Staff. Baker was the first White House Chief of Staff since Cheney. They sat down together, and Baker made notes on what Cheney told him that include this statement, by the way, with 6 stars next to it in Baker's notes. Cheney told Baker, "The president has been seriously weakened in recent years. Restore power and authority to the executive branch. Need strong leadership. Get rid of the War Powers Act. Restore independent rights." This was the lesson that Cheney took out of his first time in the White House during the Ford administration. And that is that somebody needs to stick up for presidential power because Congress is going to be a constant and vigilant threat to it. So when he came into the White House, again, long before 9/11, long before Iraq, Cheney was committed toward enhancing not just the power of the presidency, power in the sense of getting done what the president wants done, but rather the integrity of the presidency against what Cheney saw as extra-constitutional, even unconstitutional encroachments by the other branches on the presidency. And so having spent this much time on Cheney before 9/11, the less familiar part of the story, I'm going to gloss pretty quickly over what I think is much more familiar to you and what's been alluded to throughout this conference. By the way, it's hard to imagine a conference on any previous president in which the vice president would have been as mentioned as often as Cheney has been in this one. That tells you something right there. Cheney, 9/11, within a few days there was an important meeting at Camp David at which the discussion was about what to do. Cheney, I should say at this stage, was among those who resisted the argument that the United States should go after Iraq in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. It's not that Cheney didn't have Iraq and Saddam Hussein in his sights, but what he realized at the outset was one military engagement at a time. And so Cheney, at the beginning at least, was one of those who, in terms of where President Bush should make his initial response to 9/11, did not join with those, some of them within the administration, who were saying, what a great moment to bring down Saddam Hussein. Cheney started out with that amount of restraint. To an unprecedented degree, though, as the war in Afghanistan, the war against the al-Qaeda enclaves there and the Taliban regime unfolded, issues arose that simply had to be dealt with, issues that hadn't arisen in wars of a more conventional kind. One of those was, what do you do with the enemy combatants whom you capture? They're not soldiers in uniform. On the other hand, they're acting like soldiers in uniform. Cheney, advised closely by his counsel, David Addington, in effect ran roughshod over the White House counsel Alberto Gonzales, because Cheney and Addington had thought about this a lot more than Gonzales had, in making the argument that enemy combatants captured in this war on terror could be detained indefinitely and should be tried in military tribunals created exclusively under the president's authority. Cheney took a memo to Bush to that effect at lunch one day, got Bush to sign it, and there it was. As far as the war in Iraq goes, like most U.S. officials, as well as the intelligence agencies of most nations around the world, Cheney was convinced that Saddam Hussein had for some time been stockpiling weapons of mass destruction. He frequently expressed to the president his concern that Cheney was sharing those WMDs with al-Qaeda, which he was sure would try to use them against the United States. Although little in the way of reliable intelligence confirmed Cheney's suspicions of an Iraq al-Qaeda connection, he remembered from his days in the White House and as Secretary of Defense how wrong the intelligence agencies had been in 1990 about Saddam Hussein's intention to invade Kuwait. So when people say, well, what about all this intelligence that indicated that from the CIA that cast doubt on Iraq's involvement with al-Qaeda, Iraq's possession of WMDs, Cheney was from his own memory thinking the CIA is perfectly capable, almost predictably capable, of getting things wrong, of not anticipating catastrophic events that are about to happen. The CIA didn't predict that Hussein would invade Kuwait in 1990. The CIA didn't see the fall of the Soviet Union coming. The CIA simply didn't know al-Qaeda was going to hit us. Cheney didn't regard the advice of the intelligence experts as sufficiently expert to follow. Cheney, within the administration, continued to argue against seeking resolutions from the United Nations or Congress to authorize both wars. He lost both arguments, but I think the true verdict on Cheney's role in encouraging President Bush to launch a war against Iraq was well stated by the scholars Ivo Daalder and James Lindsay, who say that Bush, quote, chose to take Colin Powell's route to Cheney's goal. In other words, go through the hoops of seeking a congressional resolution, go to the United Nations, but which Colin Powell was advising. But understand that no matter what road you take, it needs to lead to an invasion of Iraq. It was Cheney's goal. He was willing to tolerate Powell's methods of getting to that goal, but no more than that. Well, the second term has not gone well for Dick Cheney, partly because it hasn't gone well for President George W. Bush, to whom, like any vice president, to whom his fortunes are inextricably tied. Cheney contributed to some extent to his own problems. He went on the Larry King live show in 2005 and then again in the middle of 2006, and both times predicted that the insurgency against American forces in Iraq was about to end. He was wildly out of touch with reality on the ground. His closest associate on his staff, Scooter Libby, was indicted and then convicted for obstruction of justice. The incident in which Cheney, out hunting, shot his friend Harry Whittington, by itself, not a terribly important incident, but you remember what a big story that became for this reason. The way Cheney conducted himself in that incident seemed to conform to people's growing negative stereotypes of Cheney. He was secretive and prone to the use of violence, it seemed. Let me say just three things by way of conclusion of this talk about Richard Cheney as vice president. First of all, he was the most influential vice president in history. I don't think I need to say another word on that point. Second, because Cheney's loyalty to the president was undivided by personal ambition, it's fair to say he was the least politically ambitious vice president in history. The certain knowledge that Cheney's name would never appear on a ballot again sometimes, though, made him reckless in his disregard for public opinion. To Cheney, the worst four-letter word that you could use in his presence began with P. Poll. For somebody to tell Cheney the polls show that this or that is unpopular drew his contemptuous dismissal. And somebody who knows he's never going to be on a ballot again, never go before the voters again, is the only kind of person who is in a position to write off public opinion that way. And then finally, Cheney's final superlative was to become the most unpopular vice president in modern history. Again, this was partly an artifact of Bush's second-term unpopularity, but only partly. The public came to regard Cheney as being uniquely powerful, but with no concern for his political future, utterly indifferent to their opinions. They were right on both counts. Thank you very much.